What are the ethical concerns at the end of life? Is it permissible for a doctor to end the life of a terminally ill patient? Welcome to Pro-Life Thinking, a podcast that trains you how to defend the pro-life position effectively and persuasively. I'm your host, Clinton Wilcox, and you'll notice on the split screen that is not my co-host, Nathan. He actually had a job interview today, and originally he wasn't going to make it, but his interview actually ended a little bit early, so he said he'll probably pop on here about 10 minutes later. So we'll see him shortly. And so, if he gets the job, he may actually end up not being able to co-host the podcast with me for much longer. So, we wish him the best of luck with that. And if that happens, then we'll go from there and see how things work out. A couple of news items that we have going on here, or at least one that I think is kind of pressing, is there have been a number of conservatives who have been actually being banned from social media, from YouTube, from Twitter, especially regarding the transgender ideology. If they've been expressing or sharing posts regarding transgender ideology from a conservative perspective, they've actually been being banned. And so, if you're not aware of an alternate video site called Rumble, I've actually been backing up all of our videos there because who knows how long it'll be until YouTube starts cracking down on other conservative sites. So if that happens, you'll be able to find us there on Rumble as well. But Ryan T. Anderson, who's probably one of the leading conservative intellectuals today, recently had his book banned from off of Amazon. And his book, When Harry Became Sally, which talks about the transgender issue from a conservative perspective, and it's been banned off of other sites too. But you can still find it on the website for the publisher itself. But recently, Abigail Shrier, who's not, as far as I know, a conservative intellectual, but she did publish a book about transgenderism, not being critical of transgender ideology itself, as far as I'm aware, but actually just of the fact that that the LGBT movement has actually been sort of forcing their ideology on children and the harm that it's doing to children. And she's recently had her book banned not once but twice from Target and from their booksellers. So so that's something that is a little bit concerning because if they've been cracking down on one conservative ideal, then who knows how long until they start cracking down on others. And so that's just something to kind of be aware of, because actually I have reached out to Abigail Shrier to see if she'd do an interview on our podcast, and I haven't heard back from her yet, but hopefully she'd be willing to do that, because that's actually something that's kind of important to me, because my own niece has been going around telling people that she's a boy, not because she struggles with any sort of gender identity issue, but simply because it's the cool thing to do amongst teenagers at school. So I really want to get her on to talk about this, especially because of how personal the issue is for me and my family. And I just got a text from Nathan that he's going to be on in a moment, so I'll add him to the stream as soon as he appears. Just a couple of things there to be aware of, because it may affect where we're able to broadcast our podcast from in the future. But now, to move on to our guest, who is a friend of mine, and I actually did some pro-life outreach with her a few years ago. And so my guest for today is Stephanie Gray Connors. Now, Stephanie Gray Connors is a seasoned and international speaker, originally from Canada, who began presenting at the age of 18. She has given over 1,000 pro-life presentations over 2 decades across North America, as well as Scotland, England, Ireland, Austria, Latvia, Guatemala, Mexico, and Costa Rica. She has spoken at many post-secondary institutions such as Yale University, George Washington University, and the University of California, Berkeley. In 2017, Stephanie was a presenter for the series Talks at Google, speaking on abortion at Google headquarters in Mountain View, California. Stephanie has debated abortion advocates such as Physicians Who Do Abortions, which includes debating late-term abortionist Dr. Fraser Fellows in front of medical students at the University of Western Ontario's Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. She has also debated Peter Singer, Princeton philosophy professor, Ron Fitzsimmons, executive director of the National Coalition of Abortion Providers, Dr. Jan Narveson, philosophy professor and recipient of the Order of Canada, Elizabeth Cavendish, legal director for Neural Pro-Choice America, and Dr. Malcolm Potts, the first medical director director for International Planned Parenthood Federation. In 2019, Stephanie participated in an historic 8-woman debate on abortion at, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, La Ciudad de las Ideas, CDI, an event similar to TED Talks, which was held in Puebla, Mexico. Stephanie's audiences are vast, including medical and law students, churches of various denominations, seminaries, high schools, and conferences. She's spoken at events for YWAM, Youth with a Mission, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Colson Center for Christian Worldview, to name a few. Besides speaking on abortion, she also presents on assisted suicide and can tailor messages for specific audiences, whether sectarian or non-sectarian. Steph is the author of the book Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide, as well as the book Love Unleashes Life, Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UBC in Vancouver and a certification with distinction in healthcare ethics from the NCBC in Philadelphia. Steph, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Clinton. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking time out. Now, I did mention that Steph has written 2 books. The one is that we're here to talk about today is Start With What? Let me switch back to my screen here, make sure it's appearing there. Yeah, Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide. And she also wrote the book Love Unleashes Life, Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth. And we actually had her on our podcast back to talk about her book and about one of the debates she had participated in. So if you want to look for that, you can find it on our podcast at blogtalkradio.com/prolifethinking. And I've also provided a link for that in the show notes down below. You can also find our podcast on iTunes if you're not subscribed to it there. But you can find our previous discussion with Steph there. Now, okay, so this episode will, of course, have the audio extracted and will make its way onto our audio-only podcast. If you're watching the live broadcast and we'll be engaging in the live chat, I'll post relevant comments and questions for our guests on the video screen. All right. Oh, and Nathan just popped in, which is good, because before we actually get to talking about your book, I know Nathan actually wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of previous debates that you participated in, if you'd be okay with that.
Sure. Yeah, why not?
Okay, so I'll go and bring Nathan on the stream here. Hey, you're a lot more well dressed than usual.
I actually just got out of another meeting, so I'm normally not this fancy on the podcast.
Right on. How'd your job interview go?
Went good. I got a formal job offer today, so I have to take care of, and then I will probably start in April.
Okay, cool. Okay, so so welcome to join us, Nathan. Before we talk about Steph's book, I know that you wanted to talk, or maybe had some questions about the debates that she participated in. If you wanted to maybe ask some of those, Stephanie recently debated Dr. Malcolm Potts and Peter Singer, who is probably one of the most well-known pro-choice philosophers there is, someone who not just defends abortion, but actually defends the moral permissibility of infanticide. I did watch your debates with Malcolm Potts a little bit. Dr. Potts tends to be a bit belligerent, so I tend to not be able to watch a debate with him all the way through. I attended a live debate with him and Scott Klusendorf, and his debate performance was pretty poor. But I wanted to see the one with Peter Singer, but unfortunately didn't get around to watching that one either. But Nathan, if you had a couple of questions, you can go ahead and get the ball rolling there.
Well, first we'll start. Stephanie, well, first off, hello, Stephanie. Sorry I kind of jumped in a little bit late. I guess we'll start with I think your most recent debate was with Peter Singer, was it not?
That's correct. Yes, it was a week after I debated Dr. Potts.
Awesome. Well, what was the topic of the debate and how did that go?
So basically, it was the question of, is abortion amoral or an immoral act? And Peter Singer, of course, taking the side that it's perfectly ethical and acceptable, and me making the point that if all humans are equal, then we ought to be treated equally. And the most foundational of all rights that we have by virtue of being a member of the human family is the right to life. So it was a great debate, I would say. It was put on by the Pro-Life Club at Harvard. And we had, I don't know how many tuned in that night, but it's now on YouTube and it's had thousands of views. So it was a great opportunity to really reach lots of people and expose the flaws of Singer's worldview.
Right. Now, what was the essence of his argument? Like, what is the basis of his argument for abortion?
Yeah, so he doesn't hold the perspective that merely being human is what protects someone or gives them rights, but instead makes the argument that it's about having certain interests or desires or being denied something and therefore, for example, causing suffering. And so would argue that preborn children don't have interests or desires and wouldn't necessarily suffer. Now, of course, early in pregnancy, the preborn child will not feel pain, but as the pregnancy progresses, the preborn child is capable of feeling pain, would suffer. But the more fundamental point that I would make is that our right to life isn't grounded in our interests and desires. Our interests and desires can change. There are times in life when we can't even express or be aware of interests and desires. Maybe we're under anesthetic, having surgery done. Maybe we're sleeping. So there are lots of circumstances in which in the present moment, we cannot express certain wishes, or we wouldn't even necessarily experience suffering. And yet even Singer himself would acknowledge you shouldn't kill someone while they're sleeping, you shouldn't kill them while they're under anesthetic, and so on and so forth.
Right. Now, thinking about that, because I know Singer has defended in the past. Now, I'm not entirely sure if it's his current position, but he has defended forms of infanticide in the past. I remember when he debated Richard Weikart several years ago on the Unbelievable radio show, he mentioned that he doesn't really hold that position anymore. But I have actually had people ask, how do you talk with somebody who holds that not only is abortion acceptable, but also infanticide is acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, you just try to be as winsome and reasonable as possible. And for that particular individual, I just hope and pray that they have a type of Saul to Paul conversion. But really, I look at engaging them in public debate as reaching the audience that's listening in. Someone
Right.
like Peter Singer seems to have a very hardened heart. And in my experience, people like him don't change their mind simply based on a presentation of reason and logic. They have become so entrenched in their mindset, and I think that's given them a type of blindness, a moral blindness to what is going on, and it requires a supernatural spiritual conversion for those individuals. But it's my hope that when the extremes of his views are exposed on a platform in which I can represent a more inclusive view, a more protective view, and a more tolerant view of the weak and vulnerable. You know, what I find fascinating in particular about Peter Singer, and this came up in debate, is how much he is an animal rights activist. And, you know, one of the points I made is that if you want to put animals on a pedestal, look at how animals work. They typically protect their own species over others. And one of the points I made in the debate was that there had been a viral video just prior to our debate of a runner in Utah who'd been going through the mountains, and he saw 2 baby cougars, and he got close to them. Well, of course, the mother's nearby, and so the mother jumps out and freaks out and basically stalks him for 6 minutes as he's backing up, you know, filming her, thinking his life is going to be over. And that cougar didn't think to herself, oh, you're a human, you are higher functioning, you have interests, desires, and you could suffer profoundly if I hurt you. Therefore, I should respect you, oh human being. No, the cougar's just thinking, I'm a mother, and you to me are a threat to my babies, and so I'm going to protect my own kind. I'm going to protect my family. And so I use that to say maybe we need to take a lesson from the mother cougars and actually start protecting our own offspring and those who are the weakest and vulnerable in our family.
Yeah, I've actually seen that video. It's pretty stressful to watch, but you know, thankfully the guy made it out of the situation okay.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, how do you?
They learn their mountain lions.
I'm sorry, Nathan, you kind of cut out there a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say there's a lesson we learned there. Don't mess with mountain lions.
Yes,
Right.
this is true. Right, and I guess Americans, you guys call them mountain lions, whereas I'm more familiar with calling them cougars.
Oh, yeah.
So it's actually funny. At least where I'm from, I'm in Southern California. We call them cougars, we call them pumas, we call them mountain lions. Mountain lions more than vernacular I'm used to, but we'll call them all three. You'll see puma, one thing, you're going, what in the world's a puma? It's a mountain lion. Why don't we just call it the same thing? No, we'll call it a puma. All right.
Okay.
Now, sorry, go ahead. I cut you off, I think.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So before we transition to your book real quick, what would you say is maybe like one of the takeaways from these debates that you had with two pro abortion thinkers, one who is an actual doctor who performs abortions, the other one is a philosopher making moral arguments that it's permissible to kill infants. What do you think is maybe a takeaway from those experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clinton. You know, when the two debates were over, and as I said, one with Singer happening after the one with Potts, I really reflected on the fact that there is often this hyper focus on how well an individual or a species functions to determine whether we protect that species. And I was doing more and more thinking of Singer's focus on, you know, being conscious, being rational, being self-aware. And I realized, although he would often say what sets, you know, adult humans or older humans and other species apart is perhaps higher brain functioning, I actually started to think, no, I think what really sets humans apart is our capacity to love. You can have someone who's brilliant, who maybe even tests as a genius, but is a psychopath and is profoundly immoral. What really matters, and when we are at our fullest as human beings, is our living out our call to love, which is to will the other's good. And so as I reflected more on these two debates, I thought more and more, I think that really needs to be the heart of the pro-life message, is our call to love. And to love, as Thomas Aquinas said, is to will the other's good. It is to be outward focused, not inward focused. And in fact, that was one of the points I made a year prior in a debate, as you mentioned in my introduction, at CDI, an event that it's kind of like TED Talks. It was held in Mexico, and I was part of an 8-woman debate. And one of my main closing points was that all of us were once a child in the womb. All of us were once dependent on our mothers, and all of us are here listening to this debate because our mothers, when they were more powerful than us, could have ended our lives by having an abortion, but by our presence here, it's a sign our mothers never did that. And instead, when our mothers were powerful, they treated us with reverence and with respect, and essentially laid down their lives for us. A type of, you know, the decision to carry a pregnancy to term and to give birth is almost like declaring, this is my body given for you, a very self-sacrificing, other-oriented perspective. Whereas abortion is all about saying, this is your body given for me. It's all about the using the other as opposed to serving the other. And so I started to think, after debating those women a year ago, and then Potts and Singer, that more and more as pro-lifers, I think we really need to be imparting a message that what we're calling people to is a spirit of self-sacrificial love, which is ultimately where we find our fulfillment as human beings. We're not happy when we're selfish. It's only when we're selfless and serving others that we really ultimately find our true joy. And at the heart of Singer's worldview and Potts' worldview is really the opposite of that. It's a perspective that leads not only to the demise of human civilization, but even to an individual.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do notice that we're getting some viewers. If you have comments that you'd like to to mention, feel free to post them. I will get them up here on the screen because we enjoy interaction amongst viewers. Or if you have questions for Stephanie, feel free to post those as well. Otherwise, we hope that we welcome you here. We hope you enjoy the conversation. So moving on now to the book. Your most recently published book is Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide. And right off the bat, with your book, Love Unleashes Life, and now Start With What? This is definitely something I think that's been missing amongst books that express a more pro-life view regarding abortion and regarding euthanasia and assisted suicide, are that you read books by folks like Frank Beckwith and Christopher Kaser, and they're all about the academic arguments, which is fine because we need to interact with and respond to arguments from folks like Peter Singer and David Boonin and Michael Tooley and folks like that. But you bring a lot of the storytelling to the arguments, where you don't shy away from the arguments. I mean, it's not a work of like robust philosophy that you might find published in a philosophy journal or something, but you don't shy away from the arguments and you do address them while also showing stories of people who have actually given a kind of a real world, kind of real world examples of these concepts that you talk about. And I think that's something that is one of the greatest benefits to your books, and one of the reasons why I definitely want to promote those, and I hope that our listeners and people do get themselves a copy and read those and study them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think it is really important in at this point, I think I'm 20 years of working full-time in the pro-life movement, and I've come to see it so important that we really be trained to reach the head and the heart. We humans are both, so it's not one or the other. It really is having a deep sense of empathy and compassion for people who suffer or go through hardship, but also realizing we do have a rational nature. And so we want to apply that, we want to employ that through thinking and through reason, through logic. And so it's really about bringing both of those worlds together to have the fullest perspective that we can share with people.
Right.
Yeah. So Nathan, if you have questions, feel free to jump in here. So I don't necessarily monopolize the time. So just to give you a heads up on that.
Well, I guess one point I'll make is I think your first chapter which is literally start with what. I think that one chapter alone was probably worth the price of the entire book, because I think that can be applied to anything, not just assisted suicide, but also talking to somebody who's considering abortion, or talking to somebody who's going through a really hard time in their life. I think that your book really, you actually touch on a lot of issues that might be of importance to people. And I think that alone is worth the price of the book. Of course, what you say about assisted suicide is also important, but there's a lot in there that I think is very, it'll appeal to everybody. When I was reading through the book, I was getting the sense that, there's something in here for everybody to take away, regardless of whether they're even thinking about assisted suicide or not. And I guess we'll just start with that one question: is when you titled the book "Start with What" and your chapter about that, what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to, start with what?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate your kind words about especially the first chapter. And the idea for that title comes from a couple perspectives. The first was just as I researched suffering and people's motivations for supporting assisted suicide and euthanasia, I came to see that people often are in situations of suffering immediately gravitate to the question of why. Why did this happen to me? Why did I get cancer? Why did I become a quadriplegic? Why is my life falling apart? And although those are natural questions to ask, the reality is twofold. One, it's a question oriented to the past, and two, it's a question where the answer isn't very satisfying. So in terms of the first point, when we think of the past, there's nothing we can do about it. We can learn from it, but we cannot undo what has occurred. So if someone has gotten into an accident and become paralyzed, that can't be undone. All they can do is work in the present moment. But the second thing is, if you ask why do some people become paralyzed, but all three of us are able-bodied? Why are some people victims of human trafficking right now, but we are not? The answers that come to my mind is life is unfair, there's evil, there's injustice. Some things happen to certain people that don't happen to others, but those answers don't really satisfy. And so what I started to think about was when we face suffering, as much as we're inclined to ask why did this occur, a more freeing question, a more inspiring question, and a more future-oriented question rather than a past-oriented question is, what can I do in response to this reality I'm facing? What amazing, wonderful, incredible thing can I bring out of this terrible, horrible, awful thing? And that question orients us to what is next, which is what we can control. And that question also really inspires people and gives us more hope with how we answer it than simply asking why. And as I dove further into this concept, I realized really my question, or my point to start with what, is really another way of phrasing Dr. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He's a Holocaust survivor and a psychiatrist who talked about how, regardless of the circumstances we face, we can always choose our response. And he talked about how we need to seek meaning. And I thought really my question of what can I bring out of this situation is another search for meaning. It's another way of phrasing that concept.
Right. A concept that came to mind when I was reading through that, I actually just finished reading another book recently. It was called Beyond the Call. It was a story about Captain Robert Trimble. He was a bomber captain in World War II. And his story, a lot of the concepts that you talked about in that chapter, it came up was he got told, he said he finished his deployment in Europe, and they told him, they said, well, you can go home, but in 3 weeks, we're probably going to activate you and have you come back and do another tour. And during World War II, bomber pilots and bomber crewmen did not have a very long life expectancy. Many didn't make it to the end of their deployment. But they said, well, we can also send you to Ukraine, and you'll be working on damaged planes that have been salvaged over there. So he did that, but he actually got tricked into doing a mission where he was rescuing death camp survivors. He actually got taken to Auschwitz by the Soviet Union and the KGB and the Soviet secret police. And he actually wound up rescuing a number of death camp survivors, as well as stranded American and British prisoners of war who were stranded in that area. And at the time, the Soviets didn't have a very humane view of prisoners of war. They actually hated prisoners of war. They treated the death camp survivors better than they treated their fellow Allied prisoners, because they believed there were no prisoners of war. And so he really exemplified that concept, because he goes, well, I just got tricked into coming over here. And he goes, if I make one mistake, I'll be facing a Soviet firing squad. But when he went to Auschwitz and he saw what was being done in Poland, he said, he goes, you know what, now I'm in a horrible situation, but I'm going to make the best of it. And he actually saved I believe it was nearly 1,000 people. And it wasn't just prisoners of war. He also saved death camp survivors. He saved a lot of 400 French women who had been kidnapped by the Nazis and taken to Poland to work basically as slaves in labor camps. And I mean, I think when you talk about in the book how storytelling really captivates us and it brings us to those moral principles in a way that even arguments might not be able to, I think that was a really great point in the book. And another good reason to buy the book, but it very much brings to the forefront why we should be thinking, you know, I'm in this bad situation, but what can I do? Or somebody I care about is in a bad situation. What can I do to help them make the best of it?
Yeah, I appreciate you observing that. And I think one of the things that I became aware of and touches on something you said a little earlier is that this message is relevant not just when discussing assisted suicide, but about life in general, because all of us suffer. That was Dr. Viktor Frankl's point. We're all going to face hardship at varying points, but we don't have to despair to the extent that we can find meaning, which is to find our what. What do I do in response to this situation? So, you know, I think even in this last year of lockdowns, you know, there's so much despair. We see an increase in suicide. And so there is a great need now, more than ever, for people to understand their worth as human beings, the importance of connection and relationship, and finding meaning even in really difficult situations, so people don't give up on life, even if it's not kind of going to be euthanasia or assisted suicide. What if someone's thinking of suicide? You know, it's my hope that in some way they come across this book and it gives them a new outlook on life and gives them purpose and gives them meaning.
Right.
Yeah, something you touch on quite a bit in the book is about perspective. That you know, we can look at our situation in despair, or we can change our perspective and realize that even though we have a short time left, there might still be a lot of good that we can do with the short time that we have left, and that can encourage us to stick around instead of trying to find a quicker way out.
Absolutely. It makes me think of one of the stories I use in the book, which is one Dr. Viktor Frankl provides of a teenager in Texas who became quadriplegic in a car accident. And Dr. Frankl said, you know, let me tell you how she spends her days. She watches the news, reads the news, listens to the news, and whenever she comes across a story of someone who's going through some type of hardship or difficulty, maybe a natural disaster, destroy their home, a fire, so forth, she will call for an assistant to come to her. And that person is asked to place a stick in her mouth because she can't move her limbs. And then this young woman uses that stick to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to the people she just read about. And that young woman is living a life of profound meaning and great purpose. It's not that her life is free of suffering. Of course, she's suffering profoundly. She's no longer able-bodied and can't do all the things she once was able to do. That would be very frustrating for a previously independent person. But she's not despairing because she has found meaning, not just in her circumstances, but directly connected to them. You know, her ability to inspire and encourage other people is because she knows loss so profoundly and so personally. And so she has turned a situation of suffering from her past that she can't control into a future-oriented perspective of, okay, what good can I bring out of this? Okay, the good I can bring out of this is to inspire other people.
Right.
Now, some people might look forward to, or not look forward as in like with anticipation, but look forward to an event that might happen near the end of their life where they don't think that they'll be able to do any good. Like if they happen to enter in a persistent vegetative state, or maybe a reversible coma, or not necessarily like a reversible coma, but like an irreversible one, where they think, well, at that point, I don't think I'm going to have any good that I can do, so I will probably ask the doctor to euthanize me at that point. How would you respond to someone who takes that view? Would you kind of appeal to one of your other principles, or do you think that there's still some good that someone might be able to do even in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, great question. So I think we need to realize, and one of the points I make in my book is that we ought to celebrate being. And I take that phrase from a billboard I saw in Canada many years ago by the Canadian Down Syndrome Society, which just had a picture of a little girl who visibly had Down syndrome. And then it said, celebrate being. And what I loved about that message was it was orienting the viewer to the idea that first and foremost, what matters is our human nature. It's who we are. Secondarily is what we can do. And yes, human beings can do amazing things, but we're not human doings, we're human beings, and we ought to celebrate that we exist. So where we are capable of doing things, we ought to act on those capabilities, like the woman even who's quadriplegic. But if someone cannot do, as long as they still are, we ought to celebrate their being, because what they are always capable of doing is being in a relationship of love, both giving and receiving love. We don't know when someone is in what's been labeled a persistent vegetative state, or if someone has very advanced dementia. We don't know exactly what they are fully aware of. And so we ought to err on the side of caution and respect them and treat them with reverence. I think of, a newborn baby. None of us remember our births. None of us remember probably the first several years of our lives. But our inability to be aware at that time did not give anyone license to harm us. And so I think we ought to look at someone who's perhaps, in a persistent vegetative state, or who is, got advanced dementia, and to think of them as like how we treat very newborn infants, that even if they don't seem to be fully aware, we can still love them. We can touch them. We can play music for them. We can hold their hand. We can sing to them. We can read to them, even if they're not responding. And that is life-giving to those individuals. And just as that's life-giving to a baby who doesn't need all types of complex games to play, or, that don't need their mind activated by a game of chess to be full and satisfied, but they need to be held, and they need to be loved, and they need to be attended to. These are experiences that we can create for people who don't appear to be able to act or function in a way that we can.
Right. Now, just kind of moving on from that, since we kind of touched on this already, your following chapter is, if all humans are equal, then we should all get suicide prevention. Could you explain that for a little bit? Explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So that kind of idea really came from something actually former colleagues of mine and friends, Jonathan Van Maren and Blaise Allain, wrote in their book on assisted suicide. And I would say where my book is explicitly and overtly Christian, although I hope even the non-religious person will draw something from it, Jonathan and Blaise have written an excellent non-religious, non-sectarian argument against assisted suicide. And in that, they propose this question: who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention? And so I ran with that question in that second chapter by looking at through the lens of a story of a police officer who patrols the Golden Gate Bridge. His name is Kevin Briggs. And his job is to basically look for people trying to jump who go there to commit suicide. Unfortunately, the Golden Gate Bridge is one of the most popular suicide destinations. People will even fly from other parts of the United States just to make suicide attempts there. And Sergeant Briggs looks for those people and then tries to interact with them and talk them off the ledge, literally, over the railing, and get them the help they need. And 200 people are alive today because of the life-saving work of Kevin Briggs. And one of the stories I tell is of one of those people, a young man, I believe he was in his late teens or early 20s. He was already in a relationship and had a newborn baby who had needed a lot of hospital care. So he had a lot of debt. He struggled with mental illness. He was overwhelmed, and he wanted to give up on life. And His name was also Kevin, but it was Kevin Berthia. And so Kevin Briggs really listened more than he talked to Kevin Berthia, and he managed to convince him to come over the railing and get help. And now years later, both Kevin Briggs and Kevin Berthia work in suicide prevention together. And I used that story to pose this question to people. Do we think Kevin Briggs did something right by trying to prevent the suicide of Kevin Berthia? And I think everyone would instinctively respond by saying, yes, of course, like he does noble work, heroic work. And then, we can get people to think, okay, well, what if Kevin Briggs wasn't a police officer patrolling the Golden Gate Bridge? What if he was a doctor working in a hospital in a state or a country where assisted suicide was legal? And what if he had an 80-year-old patient who came to him and said, look, I've been told I only have 6 months left to live. I really don't see the point of continuing. Would you give me a lethal injection, or would you prescribe a lethal dose of drugs? And a lot of people, often the same ones who would support Kevin Briggs stopping a jumper from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, would think that a physician should support a patient in that circumstance where they're near death anyways and give them assisted suicide. And so we then need to ask such individuals who seem to have this contradictory perspective, why would you help the second person with their suicide? Why would you give them suicide assistance? And they'll probably say something like, well, because I believe in autonomy and I believe in choice, and I want to respect that 80-year-old woman's choice to end her life on her terms. So then if that's how they respond, then we can say, well, wait a minute, if you respect autonomy and choice, let's go back to the Kevin Berthia scenario. Kevin, in that moment, would have told you it was his choice and he did want to die and he didn't want to continue living. So why, if you respect choice and autonomy, would you override Kevin Berthia's choice to kill himself with suicide prevention, but not override someone else's desire to kill themselves who's maybe near the end of their life, and you give them suicide assistance? What that kind of talking back and forth would reveal is, although the person claims it's about choice, it's actually about judgment. In other words, the person who gives suicide assistance to one but suicide prevention to another is making the judgment, over here is a life worth saving, but over here, you're not a life worth saving. And so we want to ask people the question, who are we to make that declaration about another person? If we believe in equality, then we should treat humans equally and either give suicide prevention to everyone or suicide assistance to everyone. Now, I realize most people would be horrified at the second thought and say, oh my gosh, you should never give suicide assistance to everyone. And that's the whole point. Of course, I agree that we shouldn't give suicide assistance to everyone, but I create that scenario to show people then the most reasonable position to hold is suicide prevention for everyone. But this in-between zone where some get help and others don't is the most illogical position to hold. And so that's really the point of that second chapter.
Yeah, every time I read one of your books, there's always something in it that kind of clarifies something to me that I had a response to, but then I read the section on in your book and I'm like, oh, that's a lot better than how I used to argue it. And in this case, on page 16, you talk about why we put animals down, and people will say, well, my dog, in fact, actually, I have a personal example of this. My mom just a couple 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, actually had to put her dog down because her dog had contracted diabetes, and it's going to be very expensive to have to continue giving him shots every couple of weeks or so. And in fact, they actually wanted to keep him overnight at the vet, and that was going to run her $2,000, and she just couldn't afford it. And so because the dog's life was going to be hard and she just couldn't afford the treatments, she ended up having to just make the difficult decision of putting the dog down. And some people look at that and say, well, my dog had had in the future a low quality of life to look forward to. It was too expensive to have to continue to medicate the dog to help him through his difficulties and things like that. And so when a dog's life is essentially too difficult to continue, we put him down, and we consider that putting the dog out of his own misery. But when it comes to an actual person who might be in severe pain or just having some kind of terminal illness, we say, well, we shouldn't put that person out of their misery because we don't kill humans. And some say if we put a dog down because they're suffering, then it seems like that's the more humane thing to do. We should do that with human beings also. And so I thought the way that you responded to that was actually very good. And I had a response to it, but it wasn't very emotionally fulfilling. And I think that I have a lot to incorporate in my own answer from the way that you explain it in your book.
Well, great, and thanks for that relevant example, even sadly from your own mom's life. But I think that is the point we need to make, is that we don't put humans down like we put dogs down, because humans aren't dogs. I mean, plain and simple, they're
Right.
not. And if they were, when grandma comes over to visit, we would put a leash around her neck and tell her to, get on the floor and eat out of the food bowl on the floor on her hands and knees, because that's what we
Right.
do with dogs. But we don't do that with humans. And so we already recognize they're different. And the other thing we need to remember is, we're humans are someone that we value because of their nature and the ability to be in a relationship with love, which regardless of circumstances, we can always love another, be givers or receivers of love. Animals are very different. They're really in our lives based on function. It's not that you can't love your pet, of course you can, but we don't get into business relationships with pets. We don't marry our pets. We treat them differently, so that if something inconvenient happens, we might say, okay, it's time to end the dog's life. But we don't do that with humans, because we recognize suffering is part of the human experience. And if we say, well, I can end the life of my grandma because she's suffering, then we open up a whole bunch of questions like, well, what degree of suffering justifies us ending that relative's life, but not another relative's life? How do we decide? I use an example in my book of a woman in Canada with fibromyalgia who wants assisted suicide right now. Most people would be horrified and say, what, fibromyalgia? Well, that's certainly not a pleasant condition to live with and can involve profound suffering to varying degrees depending on how severe your case is. And this woman, describes her suffering profoundly. But a lot of people would be like, that is not grounds to end your life. Or a ballerina who maybe can no longer do ballet because her feet got hurt. From her perspective, not being able to dance is like the suffering of someone with fibromyalgia. Would we be okay with helping a loved one who's a ballerina end her life because she can't perform anymore? We wouldn't be, even though we might end the life of a horse who can't perform on a farm anymore by, doing whatever we needed the horse to do for us or the cow to do for us. So, the point simply is we treat them differently because they're different.
There's this no problem. There's this idea going around that that pets are basically like family members, and aside from the question of should we put grandma down who has a difficult road ahead of her, whenever someone talks about like their pets as their fur babies or something, I kind of use the same examples, because I have a dog. I love my dog, but she's not a family member. I don't make members of my family go to the bathroom outside or drink from a bowl on the floor. So I kind of use the same examples when we talk about our pets' family. Nathan, if you had something, go ahead, and then we actually got a question from the comments that we can tackle here.
Yeah, one that just came to mind. Chris Kaiser talks about this in his book, Defense of Dignity, and he points out that he was responding to an article that Steven Pinker wrote where he goes, human dignity is a stupid concept. He goes, there's always things like human beings do that, going to the restroom, getting out of bed in the morning, sex, just a lot of things that we do that don't have a lot of dignity. He goes, we need to respect autonomy more. And something you just mentioned and brought that up, Chris Kaiser responded and he pointed out, he goes, why do we respect autonomy in the first place? Why should we respect human autonomy in the first place? And he goes, it's because deep down we really do know that humans are different than every other animal. We do know that humans have something special about them. And that's why we need to respect them. That's why we respect autonomy in the first place. And I remember in Jonathan Van Maren and Blaise Alleyne's book, they talk about they call it trotting out the teenager, and they bring up the example of, if we can use assisted suicide to eliminate somebody's suffering, where do we draw that line? What if a teenager is suffering? He just went through a really bad breakup. Should we give him assisted suicide? And most people say no. It's like, okay, you obviously believe there is a line that we need to draw somewhere. We need to establish where that line is going to be drawn.
Yeah, great point. It was a little hard to hear you for the first part, but I caught what you said at the end. And I think, bringing up the example of teenagers is hugely important, because wherever there is suicide, we always see an increase in suicides. Apparently that happened after famous actor Robin Williams committed suicide. I cite that in my book. There was a news article that talked about there was an increase in suicides amongst, middle-aged men at that time. And the same is true with assisted suicide, where you have it occurring amongst some. There are other people that jump on that bandwagon, and we're seeing that in my, original home country of Canada, where already assisted suicide has been legal for 5 years, and now there's an effort right now in the government to broaden access to it. And already over the 5 years of its legalization, the numbers have gone up. So the danger then with embracing assisted suicide is, what do you do when you have someone like a teenager who goes through a hard time? And it's often teens who do find themselves, some of them, faced with suicidal ideation. If we embrace ending someone's life, grandma's life, for example, because she's going through hardship, what lesson are we leaving to her grandchild, a teenager, who a month after the assisted suicide might think, well, if it was okay for grandma to give up on life, why isn't it okay for me to give up on life? Because grandma was suffering and I'm suffering. And to a teenager who's going through a difficult time, that type of suffering is perhaps the only suffering they know. And it's as big to them as perhaps some catastrophic injury or cancer diagnosis is for someone who's lived a longer life.
Right.
All right. So from the comments, we have MM who left one. And MM says, I came across a viral pro-choice post on social media and saw a lot of teenage girls in the comment section saying they wouldn't mind having never been born. How do you reach someone like this?
Oh, that's a great and I would say sad question. And I think I can relate to that insofar as my observation of the culture working with college students and high school students is all too often we're seeing people who don't have a sense of their self-worth or meaning in their life and think, yeah, what is the point of being here? I wish I'd never been born. I wish my parents had aborted me, that type of sentiment. So I think when we hear that from people, we very much need to realize the way to reach them is through the heart and not the mind. So if we try to appeal to logic, it's likely going to fall flat. I think if there's an opportunity to dialogue with one such person, preferably not in front of a crowd, because the more heart conversations really are more sensitive and shouldn't have a large audience. So if there's a way to meet with someone one-on-one or talk with them one-on-one, we want to ask them more about why they feel that. And also, I think to ask, have they always felt that? When were times in their life where they felt more happy about life and about their existence versus now where they kind of think, if I didn't exist, it wouldn't really matter. And why those two questions are important is it's going to help explain what happened in between. And what happened in between could perhaps be some abuse or some trauma, some broken relationship that has then impacted that person's worldview. But the fact that they hopefully at one point didn't feel that way, we help them identify, well, what made you feel more positive back then? And how do you tap into that now? The other thing that I think is important for people who feel like they have no sense of self-worth is what we fill our minds with multiplies. So if we fill our minds with negative attitudes, then we're going to just see everything through that negative lens. So one of the things I think that is so important when people are despairing or don't see their sense of self-worth is to read, study, or watch the stories of people who have gone through hard times and profound suffering, but have come out of that with an incredibly positive perspective, who have a love of life and would never want to give up on life. I think, for example, of Joni Eareckson Tada, a woman who, when she was about 16 years old, dove into water that was too shallow and she became a quadriplegic. She's now, I believe, in her 70s. And she lives a life of incredible meaning and inspiration, but it still has hardship. Not only is she quadriplegic, but years or decades later, she developed chronic pain. So here's someone who shouldn't be able to feel pain because of her paralyzed limbs, is not only paralyzed, but actually feels pain all the time. Then she developed breast cancer. Last December, she actually, so just a couple months ago, had COVID. So, I mean, it's one thing after another, but you watch the videos of this woman. She's smiling, she's happy, she's talking about trusting God. She admits that life is hard. She talks about times when she was suicidal, but how we need to push through and we need to hang on. And so I think when someone questions their existence, to look to examples of someone like Joni Eareckson Tada, at least I know for myself, when I've gone through hard times and I've watched her videos, I think to myself, okay, if she can do this, I can do this. Like, what I'm going through is nothing compared to what she goes through. And so we want to fill our lives with those types of examples rather than what sometimes happens, especially in the world of social media, where teenagers get into this dark underworld where they meet other suicidal minded teens, and then it's one negative after another, and they're all, and then you can get these pacts to commit suicide together. So we want to orient people to the positive, uplifting stories, not to the negative, depressing ones.
Right. You know,
Yeah. So yeah, no worries. So yeah, thank you very much for your question, and yeah. So yeah, thank you for your response there too, Steph.
You're welcome.
I think Clinton have a bad habit of talking over each other. We even do it when we're in the same room. But when we first started the podcast, it was audio only, and we were really bad about it.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's difficult to do a podcast and avoid that when you're not in the same room. Then again, some people do it in when they are in the same room. You're welcome, MM.
I wanted to move on to your next chapter because something that came to mind when I was reading it is veteran suicide is an issue that is it's one that's been on my radar. I'm a veteran myself, and I've known a couple of soldiers who did take their own lives at one point. And you talk about, we can eliminate suffering without eliminating the sufferer. And that also was that's another chapter that's worth the price of the book, because it does, I think that can be applied to anything. I mean, I was sidewalk counseling a few weeks ago at an abortion clinic in San Diego, and we spoke with a young man who his child had a heart defect, and he was brokenhearted over the entire idea of getting an abortion. But that was what we were trying to communicate to him is, hey, yeah, it's going to be hard. It's going to suck. But, there is hope. I mean, that is your child right there, and they are counting on you. And I told him, I said, you're a man who has a lot of heart, and you have a lot of love in you, and I can see that just from talking with you right now. And we definitely had an impact on him. He was very thankful to be speaking with us, because nobody else was listening to him on that. And that was something in your chapter that really came to mind, was this idea that, we can help alleviate suffering. There's a group that I follow called 22 Until None, and they do outreach about veteran suicide. And this is one of their common talking points is, just sometimes being there with the person when they're hurting the most is what's going to do the most good for them.
For sure. I mean, the gift of presence is huge. Some of the greatest support we can give is being side by side with someone going through a difficult time. And when they're expressing their sorrow, they know that it's being heard. And that someone cares enough to give the gift of their time shows them their life is worth living. And I think, as I mentioned in my references to Viktor Frankl, we can't entirely eliminate suffering from this world, but absolutely the point of that third chapter is we can alleviate it. And, for someone who's in physical pain, that might be better pain meds, which we have today that we didn't have, 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. But there's still some physical pain that we can't entirely eliminate, but we can still alleviate it by holding someone's hand, giving them, our presence, watching a movie with them, reading to them. There's so many things that we can do. And I think also helping that person see that their own suffering and how they respond to it can become a gift to someone who down the road experiences that same type of suffering. One of the stories I briefly share in my book is of my friend Lisa, who lives with bipolar disorder. And this has been a very serious plague in her life, particularly in her late teens and 20s. She's been hospitalized, had psychosis, suicidal ideation, all different kinds of things. But now she's in her 30s. She holds down a job. She goes to her counselor. She takes her meds. She had a great artistic outlets. She loves music. She loves poetry. She loves writing. She's writing her memoir. She's part of self-help groups where she not only gets help, but she then is a peer to help other people get help and encouragement. And she has turned this very dark period of her life that has been hard for her into a gift to others. And I even wrote her because I was talking to someone who read my book, and that person has a relative who's going through serious psychosis and mental illness right now. And he said, when I read about your friend Lisa, that gave me hope. That helped me see this isn't the end of, the path for my loved one, that they can get through this. But it was Lisa who taught that person that. It wasn't me. My book happened to share Lisa's story, but the point was, so whether it's Lisa or whether it's a veteran who was suicidal but didn't commit suicide, they're the best person to help the next veteran who's suicidal to not commit suicide. And then that gives their own historical suffering profound meaning and purpose.
Right.
Yeah, I just had a couple more questions I wanted to get to before we wrap up here. So we talked about a couple of the principles from your book, and obviously there are 8 more that we didn't really touch on here, or 1 or 2 that we kind of alluded to. So definitely, pick up Stephanie's book to to read all 10 of the principles. They're all great, and they're all kind of in short, bite-sized chapters too. So it won't take you, you know. It won't take you very long to really get through them, but they're all very helpful. Something that actually kind of occurred to me last night, and this is kind of more of a personal question. I wish it would have come to me sooner because I could have at least sent it to you before to give you some time to maybe think about it. So this might put you on the spot just a little bit, Steph. But as a Catholic, how is it that you can remain a Christian knowing that so many people are suffering, some quite extreme, and that God doesn't intervene to stop or at least alleviate so many people's suffering? Can you maybe speak to your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I address in the book. It really comes from a story of this wonderful Catholic Christian family I know, who interview them, and they have a daughter who's severely disabled and regressed from being able-bodied to not being able to move at all, and not really being able to communicate other than make noises to indicate if she's distressed in some way. And she's now in her late 30s, and she's cared for by her very aged parents around the clock, who are in their, I think, 60s and early 70s. They get up every night. They have to turn her over so she doesn't get bed sores because she can't turn herself over. And I asked the parents, how they're doing, as believers with this great suffering. And the dad admitted, he said, we're tired. And one of the things he shared was that when they're at church and they hear readings about Jesus healing people and helping the blind see and, going to Peter's mother-in-law and healing her when she was sick, he thinks, yeah, Lord, why not us? Like, we've prayed for healing. How come our daughter hasn't been healed when these other people are healed? And I asked him then, how do you resolve that question that comes up in your heart? And he pointed to John chapter 6 in the scriptures when Jesus was with a crowd as well as his apostles. And he said to them, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you will not have life within you. And some people heard this, they're like, what are you talking about? What do you mean eat your body? Like, that's crazy. And so some people questioned it and some people walked away. And Jesus looked to Peter and said, will you also go? And Peter looked to Jesus and said, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. And that is kind of the place that this father of this very disabled daughter has come to, where he can't fully explain why his daughter isn't healed when they've prayed and asked, while other people do seem to get their prayers answered. But he thinks to himself, to whom shall I go? Where else do I go? You have the words of eternal life. And so that's kind of how I frame it in the book is, if we dismiss God and get angry at God when we suffer because he doesn't respond to our suffering the way we want, we have one of 2 options: to run to the opposite of God, which would be Satan, which is just a recipe for serious disaster because we are not going to be helped or consoled. I mean, Satan clearly has a clear mission to want to destroy humans, not help humans. So then the third option, or the second of those 2 options, is to then deny that Satan or God exists and just kind of live in this zone where there is no higher power. And I only briefly address this, and there's theologians that go into it in much more detail. But one of the points that I make is that if we say there's no God, I mean, it's just so illogical. It's like if you see a beautiful painting and you think, well, it just came out of nowhere. Well, no, how does a beautiful painting come out of nowhere? It must be done and completed by an artist. And so intelligent design requires an intelligent designer. And so to live in this complex world and be the complex creatures that we are, to think that we just appeared out of nothing without a higher power doesn't explain the complexities of who we are. So then I say, if Satan is not going to be soulless, and if believing in no God is not logical, then where we are wisest to default is to say, God is good, he's all powerful, and I don't know why I'm not healed. I don't know why this evil is happening and not being solved in a way that I would like it solved. but I don't know because I'm creature and I am incapable of fully understanding this. So I trust that God knows more, and that if something doesn't make sense to me, it's because I'm incapable of understanding, not because he's incapable of being good. And the analogy I use is, a parent caring for their child, and the child, let's say, wants a chocolate donut with nuts in it, and maybe the child is allergic to nuts, and they're going to have an anaphylactic reaction, and the parent says, no, you can't have the chocolate donut with nuts, and the child might think the parent is being cruel by denying that chocolate donut with nuts, but the parent is actually being loving, and the child just doesn't understand anaphylactic reactions, don't understand that they could die, but the parent loves the child, so their decision, while it appears cruel, their withholding of something that seems good appears cruel, it's actually not. And so in these situations where we don't see immediate healings, I default to saying there is mystery, there are some things we don't understand, but the one thing that I hold to is God is good even when I am not all-knowing myself.
And so what's the next issue of Bioethics we can expect a book from you on relating stories?
Actually, yeah, I'm working on that right now. I'm working on the same style of book of questions and stories, sectarian and non-sectarian arguments on the subject of in vitro fertilization, which is another big controversial issue. I myself, I think the screen only goes to about here, but I'm pregnant right now and I'm due to give birth in August. And I know once that baby comes, life will be very busy. So my goal is to crunch that IVF book out before this baby comes in August. So it
well,
probably be released. Thank you. It probably won't be released in August, but I will at least have it done, and then we'll do a year-end release of that book. So stay tuned for that, the apologetics book on IVF.
Okay, great. IVF is definitely a topic that I think pro-life people need to, come to, or at least could use more robust arguments with. It's something that actually comes up quite a bit, is the consistency argument that if we oppose abortion, why don't we oppose IVF? Because of course so many excess embryos are created and destroyed and experimented on and things like that. And so more books on the topic of IVF I think are definitely needed, because that tends to be an issue that's kind of neglected among pro-life people. Not for any nefarious reasons, but it's just something that a lot of people tend not to focus on because the issue of abortion is so prevalent and pressing. So I'm definitely looking forward to that, and we'd love to have you back to promote that book once you get that published as well.
Great, sounds good. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, so if you sit tight for a moment, we can say our official goodbyes as soon as we end the broadcast here. But our guest today has been Stephanie Gray Connors. She recently published a book, Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide, which you can find on Amazon, major book retail sites. If you enjoyed the discussion we had today and would like to be notified when we have more, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and that way you'll always be notified when we're about to go live with other guests. In fact, this coming Monday, we're going to be having an interview with Debbie Garrett, who is a doctor in Australia who wrote a book about something she calls alarmist gatekeeping theory. So that's actually a new term for me. So we're going to have her on to talk about a book she recently published about this topic. And that's going to be Monday at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We managed to find a good median time between Australia and California that didn't keep either of us up to the wee hours in the morning. So if you appreciated the discussion and would like to contribute financially to the podcast, if you'd like to help the podcast be all that it can be, you can go to the Life Training Institute website at prolifetraining.com. Click on donate from any at the top. You can give a one-time gift or monthly gift. Just make sure you put my name in the note section so Life Training Institute knows to put the donation into my account. And the advantage of donating through LTI is that donations are tax deductible. But if you'd like to receive some perks regarding the Pro-Life Thinking podcast itself, you can find us on Patreon, and we have several great perks available. We can put your name in a slide at the end of the program, or said verbally, depending on how many we get. You can, up to and including personal one-on-one training with me, or I can look over something you've been writing if you want some feedback, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of great perks you can get if you want to donate through Patreon, and you can find the Patreon link in notes section here in the YouTube video. So we'd love to have you partner with us. But again, this podcast will always remain free. We don't want to put any of this information behind a paywall. So if you can't afford to give, this will always be free. We appreciate you just coming in and checking out what we have to say. And, we appreciate having you here. And for those in the audio podcast, if you're interested in more on that, you can find us on iTunes and blogtalkradio.com/prolifethinking. So you can feel free to spread this around social media, Facebook, MeWe, Gab, whole bunch of them starting up now. But wherever you frequent, you can spread this around as well. So once again, for those of you who joined us and for those of us who will come across this video later, we just want to thank you for being with us and for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.